My pleasure to introduce this morning Adam Weiser for this next session. Adam is an associate for Whitman, Requart and Associates in their Wilmington, Delaware office. He has over 16 years of experience in all facets of traffic engineering, including work zone traffic control, safety analyses, and traffic design. Adam was the safety programs manager at the Delaware Department of Transportation for 9 years, where he managed, among other things, the department's work zone safety and mobility program, including a team of safety officers whose prime responsibility was the review of highway work zones statewide. Adam holds a Bachelor of Science from the University of Delaware and is a registered professional engineer in Delaware, Pennsylvania, and West Virginia, as well as a certified professional traffic operations engineer and road safety professional. Adam.
All right, great. Thank you, Rusty. And we can add Washington, D.C. to that list of PEs, but nobody's counting. So thank you, everybody, for joining today. And, when it was Rusty and Matt Carter approached me about this topic, it was one that I kind of had to scratch my head a little bit and think about, what can we do for limited space work zones? Because these are the types of work zones that can lead to potential unsafe situations for workers and for the traveling public. And so, when they asked me to pull this together, I thought it was a great topic, and hopefully folks will get some information out of this. And please don't hesitate to stop me if you have any questions. All right, so I want to talk about some examples of limited space work zones. What do they look like? They're definitely not like the one shown in the picture there. They're a little bit longer than that. But what types of examples do we have? What's considered a limited space work zone? Get into a little bit about temporary traffic control in general. And I think that's important. It's important to understand the basics of temporary traffic control so that we can better plan work zones, regardless if they're in limited space situations or not. And then I want to talk about work durations and how the work durations affect the type of traffic control you utilize. And that's an important thing to consider when you're thinking about a limited space work zone. And then finally, we'll talk about a couple typical situations. All right, so, examples of limited space work zones, I have several listed here. Medians of divided highways, roadways with narrow cross sections, work in the center of a roadway, work areas with no escape routes, and limited space behind temporary barrier. These are all different types of limited space work zones, and maybe you're not thinking that you're in an area where there's limited space, but you could be. It's basically going to be at any area where you have limited room to work. There's no buffers between you and the traffic. There's no escape routes, things of that nature. Even when working in a median of, behind barrier, there's things that you have to think about, not just the fact that you're protected by the barrier, but if that barrier is struck and that barrier deflects into your work zone, is it going to create a safety issue for the workers? Is equipment or materials blocking that barrier from deflecting properly, and how is that going to react in traffic? Those are all things that we have to think about when we're laying out and designing work zones, and especially dealing with limited space work zones. So again, I want to touch on in detail. I want to talk about general temporary traffic control. And I think having that understanding of basic temporary traffic control will help us understand how we can deal with limited space work zones. So temporary traffic control in general is any time that we interrupt the normal function of a roadway for work zones, for a special event, incidents, those types of things. Anytime we close a road or close a lane or even close a sidewalk. The manual and uniform traffic control devices requires us to provide for all road users. So it's motorists, bicyclists, and pedestrians, including those with disabilities. So all those road users need to be taken into account when designing and planning out your work zones and your traffic control. And again, types of work zones, we're looking at highway construction, could be utility work, installation, repair, or relocation of utilities, any types of maintenance operations, including mowing, those types of things, and traffic incidents as well. Those are all types of different work zones that we have to consider. When you're looking at temporary traffic control, each temporary traffic control zone or TTC zone is different. There's things that go into the planning of your work zones. You need to consider the work duration. How long is the work going to take place? How long are the workers going to be present in that area? Where is the work occurring? Is it on the shoulder? Is it well off the roadway where we don't need any type of traffic control, maybe just an advanced warning sign? Is it in the middle of a roadway, in the middle of a travel lane? Is it in the middle of an intersection? All those things need to be taken into account. What type of roadway are we working on? Is it a local road? Is it in a subdivision? Is it on the interstate? That also it plays a huge role in trying to plan out our work zones. Roadway geometrics is important mainly for sight distance. Is the roadway that we're working on, is it on a horizontal curve or is there a vertical curve that's blocking sight distance? That gets into looking at buffer space and things of that nature. Where are the locations of intersections? If we have a lane closure on an arterial roadway, is that lane closure going to back traffic up to adjacent signalized intersections and cause gridlock? So that needs to be taken into account. What's our road user mix? Do we have pedestrians? Do we have bicycles? Sometimes in Delaware, we've had a couple situations where we've had to deal with horse-drawn buggies in our Amish country, Western Kent County. So all those folks need to be taken into account when you're designing your traffic control. What type of vehicles are we dealing with? Are we dealing with mainly passenger cars? Are we dealing with trucks? Are we dealing with people that aren't familiar with the area in resort areas, those types of things? And then vehicular speeds as well. Are we dealing with high speed or low speed traffic? The goal overall is to provide a safe traffic control zone so we have minimal disruption to road users, but we give enough space to the workers to get the work done. And the thing that we look at is being as efficient as possible and trying to get. Sometimes we want to try to get more work done than we can in order to minimize how long we're actually going to be in the roadway. So some rules and regulations that we generally follow. The federal rules, we have the Federal Manual and Uniform Traffic Control Devices, the METCD. Pretty much everybody knows about that. There's final rules on work zone safety and mobility. Those look at back in 2008, 2007, 2008 timeframe, some new rules came out related to how we deal with traffic impacts in work zones and also regulations on law enforcement in work zones, positive protections in work zones, those types of things. So that plays a role in what we want to do. We have design guidance through AASHTO, mainly the roadside design guide. Towards the end of the roadside design guide, there's some guidance with respect to work zones and the use of crash-worthy devices. State rules, so state law. So for example, Delaware Code, other states have their requirements as well. State manuals on uniform traffic control devices, or some states may have a supplement to the federal METCD, and then you have DOT guidelines for design guidance as well. And if you're working in a local jurisdiction, like in a municipality, they may have some rules of their own as well. So you want to keep those in mind. From a design guidance standpoint, I mentioned the METCD. We have the roadside design guide. You have the AASHTO manual for assessing safety hardware, which really talks about how we crash test our work zone devices. So most of our work zone devices are crash tested. They have to be crash worthy. So that's one topic that everybody needs to be aware of at least. We have state and local design guidance, as I mentioned earlier, and there's a bunch of work zone training and guidance and research that's out there through ATSA or the American Traffic Safety Services Administration. They put out a lot of work zone training beyond just the temporary traffic control technician, traffic control supervisor, beyond the flagger training. They have a lot of, through the FHWA grant courses, a lot of grant course information and brochures and guideline documents that can be looked at and referred to when trying to design a work zone. ARPA, TRB, NCHRP, they all have guidelines and research for work zone safety training, LTAP training and guidance, as well as many others. So as we, again, get into trying to figure out how we're going to deal with a limited space work zone, it's good to understand the components of a work zone. And most work zones will have four main components. You'll have an advanced warning area, a transition area, activity area, and termination area. The advanced warning area informs road users of what to expect. This can be done through a sign, a simple road work ahead sign, just giving the driver an advance warning that, hey, there's something going on up here. You need to pay attention. And we know how well those work. It could be a vehicle on the shoulder with flashing beacons. Maybe it's a TMA, a shadow truck with flashing beacons and an arrow board in advance of a moving operation. Or for longer term work zones, it could be a series of advanced warning signs for a lane closure or a lane shift. The distance of your advance warning is going to depend on the type of work, the duration of work, and the type of road. If it's a moving operation, your advance warning distance might not be that long. It simply might be a truck on the shoulder giving you that advance warning that there's something going on in front of that vehicle, or that there's a work crew on the shoulder of the roadway. It could be 2 miles, 3 miles in advance if it's on the interstate and it's high speed, high volume roadways. You could have much longer advance warning areas for those types of roadways. Your transition area. This is where we're directing the road users out of their normal path through a taper, typically. It could be a merging taper for a lane closure. It could be a lane shift taper, or even a shoulder closure taper. But this is an important area. If we provide a gradual transition area, it's generally going to keep motorists in their lane and hopefully out of your workspace. But if we go and provide no taper or no transition area or very abrupt transition areas, that could lead to erratic movements because drivers aren't expecting that, and could lead to having vehicles in your work area. Taper lengths, most of you know this probably. We have two different types of calculations for figuring out taper lengths based on the speeds of the roadway and the width or the offset of the lane closure or lane taper and the speed of the roadway. So those are taken into account when we're trying to lay out our transition areas, and I just put that there for reference mainly. Some examples of the different types of tapers. At the top, we have the merging taper. This is where we close a lane. This one we want as long as possible to allow for traffic to shift over gradually and merge with the open lane of travel as safely as possible. We have shifting tapers, which is kind of in the downward middle section there, where we're shifting traffic out of their normal path, but there's no lane closure. And then you have your shoulder taper, and coming out of your work zone, you also have a downstream taper, which is optional. But that's alerting the motorists that, hey, the road work area is done, and we can resume normal operations. The activity area, probably probably one of the most important areas. This is where the work is taking place, and this is where we get into the limited space. The METCD recommends buffer spaces, both longitudinal and lateral, so next to you and behind you, from a buffer standpoint, and that's to provide protection of the workers away from traffic. The goal is to keep traffic away from the work area as much as possible. So having this buffer space allows that to happen. Lateral buffer space just literally gives that extra sense of better feeling away from higher speed traffic. Generally on higher speed roadways, we try to get at least an additional lane of buffer between the workers and the traffic if possible. It's not always possible, unfortunately, but that's what we strive to do that in those situations. The longitudinal buffer space is good for if you're working on a curvy roadway and you have limited sight distance. You can give longitudinal buffer to your flaggers, between your flaggers and your work area for like a 2-lane roadway, to give them the traffic the ability to see the flagger and react to the flagger appropriately, rather than having your flagger in a bad spot on a blind curve or something like that, and then leading to abrupt stops. Also, buffer space can give you area to have shadow vehicles with TMAs to protect your workers. But the one thing the buffer space is not for, it's not for storing equipment or materials. The buffer space is simply that. It is buffer space for, in case an errant vehicle were to come into your work zone, you have enough space to allow that vehicle to not get into your workers and not strike your workers. Termination area. This is the where we direct the road users back to their normal path and their normal operations. Typically, it's denoted with an end roadwork sign, could be a speed limit sign or some other type of warning sign or informational sign. The taper is generally short, 50 to 100 feet. And the buffer space, again, you may have that downstream of your work zone as well. That can be for protection of your workers, or just to again keep the traffic out of the work area as much as possible. So, any questions so far? Is there any questions in the chat pod?
Nothing yet, Adam.
Okay, great. So the next thing we want to look at, besides just understanding the general components of a highway work zone, are the durations of work. And this is a major factor in how we figure out what types of devices we're going to use, the number of devices, and what types of information we're going to give to the traveling public. There's 5 categories of work duration, and these are spelled out in the METCD section, chapter 6G. It's the long-term stationary. This is generally our fixed work zones, work that occupies a location more than 3 days. Generally, we'll use traffic barrier, and drums and permanent warning signs, those types of things. We have intermediate term stationary. Now, this one's a little confusing. It's work that occupies a location more than 1 daylight period up to 3 days. So basically 1 to 3 days. Or it's nighttime work lasting more than 1 hour. So you could have a lane closure for the nighttime hours just for one night, and that's considered intermediate term stationary. And this is important because for nighttime operations, you need devices with higher reflectivity so the drivers can see them as they approach your work zone. Short-term stationary is work that occupies a location for more than 1 hour within a single daylight period, and that's a fixed location. And that differs from short duration, where it's work that for short duration is work that occupies a location up to 1 hour, and then it might move to another location after that 1 hour period. Mobile work is work that moves intermittently or continuously, and those are pretty straightforward. Could be sweeping operations, pavement marking operations, those types of things. For long-term stationary work zones, the luxury we have here in most cases, not all the time, but most cases, we have ample time to plan these out. You'll generally get the full complement of devices. As I said, you're looking at probably temporary traffic barrier, larger channelizing devices, signs, maybe guide sign changes, additional warning signs beyond the standard road work ahead, those types of things. We're going to be altering pavement markings because we're probably going to be shifting traffic out of their normal travel lanes. Temporary roadways and temporary pavement are included, but these still have limited space work zones. So again, the example I gave earlier, when you're working in the median of an interstate and that median's only 10 feet wide, that's a limited space work zone, especially if you have barrier on both sides. We had a project in Delaware a few years ago where we were replacing the concrete median barrier that was dividing North and South 95. And for that project, because of the limited space, we knew we needed to maintain positive protection during the project when the existing median barrier was removed. So we were going to end up with temporary barrier on either side of the roadway. But to give the contractor more space, we opted with utilizing a movable barrier system that when the contractor was working during the nighttime hours, they could move the barrier out to take an additional buffer lane. And they ended up taking actually 2 lanes in that case to give them more space to work, space for concrete trucks to come in and pour the concrete for the barrier. Those considerations were made for that work zone. But without the movable barrier, they would have very limited room. And we may have had to look at possibly pinning the barrier in certain areas to reduce the deflection if the temporary barrier was struck. So that's an example of how even a long-term stationary work zone can have a limited space area. Intermediate term stationary work zones, these are the ones that include nighttime operations, and the METCD requires that retroreflective or illuminated devices shall be used. Work zone lighting is going to be used in these situations. Generally, you're going to have channelizing devices, drums for the most part, signs, shadow vehicles with TMAs. You may not have altered pavement markings in an intermediate stationary work zone. Generally, you're not out there long enough for the temporary pavement markings or altered pavement markings to have a benefit. In limited situations, you might use barrier, but the time that it's going to take to deploy all of those devices, the barrier, the additional channelizing devices, signs, it could lengthen the project and expose the workers to more traffic than what is necessary. So that's something to keep in mind when you're planning out your work zones. If you can minimize the exposure time of the workers, that minimizes how much time they're going to be out facing issues with traffic. Short-term stationary work zones these are going to be typically your maintenance and utility operations. Generally last a day. Generally less devices or more portable devices. Will typically use cones rather than drums. Likely use flaggers for a lane closure on a 2-lane roadway. Signs with portable sign stands, and then obviously you're going to have shadow vehicles with your truck-mounted attenuators. Typically, these devices are going to be deployed and picked up the same day, so hence the need for them to be more portable. Again, you don't want to have you want to have enough devices to provide enough information to the traveling public, but not so much where you're taking more time deploying the devices than you are to physically complete the work. Again, you can have limited space work zones in this situation. The picture in the example here, they're working in the center of the roadway. It's a 3-lane roadway in this area. There's traffic on both sides. The workers have no escape route if somebody were to come into that work zone for some reason. So in those situations, you want to consider a buffer lane to try to move traffic away from you, or maybe doing that during less off-peak hours where there's less traffic. Those types of considerations can be made in these situations. So for short duration and mobile work zones, they kind of go hand in hand. These activities will require different traffic control strategies. Generally, your devices are going to be very mobile. You could have signs that are mounted on trucks. You could have cone trucks or trailers for easy deployment of cones if necessary. If you're not going to use cones, if you're just doing a mobile operation and closing lanes that way, you're going to have shadow vehicles with truck-mounted attenuators in order to close those lanes. And your vehicles are going to have strobe lights and beacons in order to give extra emphasis to the approaching traffic. And keep in mind, again, in these situations, the longer you're out there to set up and remove traffic control, the more exposure that your workers are going to have to traffic. So any questions so far? A couple more slides here, and then we can open it up to detailed questions if anybody has any. So a couple things, solutions that we can consider. Here we have, work location is in the center of a 2-lane roadway. So this is 1 lane in each direction. There's a median that separates the directions of travel. And in this case, they are improving the median curbing and drainage. So what we end up with is traffic on either side of your work crews and no escape route. So there's a couple solutions that we can consider. If it's a long-term work zone, positive protection is probably one that we really want to think about hard. Where that barrier is placed in relationship to the actual work area to make sure that it's, first of all, safe, second of all, constructible, is important. So if we need to shift traffic away from the work area, if we have a shoulder that is capable of handling traffic, that's the first thing we need to do is shift that traffic away, give the workers enough space to do the work, place the barrier to a point where there is some buffer between the workers and the deflection of the barrier if that barrier is struck. If we have an additional lane, if we're able to, we can close that to provide a lateral buffer. In a couple situations where I've been involved with, we've done the median in sections, and we've utilized flaggers to alternate traffic on one side of the roadway. So there's really in that case you're only dealing with one direction of travel at a time. You're flagging your traffic through your work zone, and you're taking into account the fact that you have an escape route now for your workers if somebody were to come into your work zone for some reason. And then you do have the option, if your jurisdiction will allow it, to close the road and detour traffic, especially if you don't have the space to shift traffic away from the median area, or provide positive protection, or you're not able to flag the traffic, closure is probably the only option at that point.
Adam, can we back up to slide 18? We did have a question come in on that one.
Sure.
The question is, where the temporary work is in a center lane, is it advisable to push the cones out a bit to narrow those lanes and give more workers room, or is it better to keep those cones on the lane markings?
So in that situation, I think you want to try to give the workers as much room as possible. So yeah, I think you could consider pushing the cones further out and narrowing the adjacent travel lanes. In this situation, I might close the 2 right lanes, depending on the configuration and what you have behind the picture, what we're not seeing in the picture behind us. You close the 2 left or 2 right lanes and run 1 lane of traffic past that work zone rather than 2 on either side. I had a construction manager that used to work for DelDOT, and in this, not necessarily in this situation, but a center lane closure on the interstate, we never allowed that, and the reason being is you wouldn't want to be that person standing at that point with that high speed traffic approaching you, trying to figure out to go left or right. We always kind of coined it as put the man with the blindfold and a cigarette out there and see how lucky he is. In this situation, my preference would be to close an additional lane and keep traffic just to one side of the work zone. If you don't have that option, you could consider pushing the cones out further to give the workers a little bit more space to work in. That also does help calm the traffic down. It slows them down by narrowing the lanes, so you do get that added safety benefit as well.
Thank you. Are there any other questions at the moment on what Adam has going?
That's a great question.
Okay.
All right. So we talked about that solution there. So we're going to go on to this one here. So another location, a roadway with a narrow cross section. So here, kind of an example picture. We have narrow lanes. There's no shoulders. Where do you put your equipment, your workers? Do you have enough room if you were to set up channelizing devices and close one of these lanes and use flagger control? Do you have enough room to physically allow traffic to safely pass your work zone without encroaching and knocking down all your channelizing devices all the time? In a long-term situation, we might consider doing some temporary widening to provide some additional space to do the traffic control. But that's not possible in a short-term or short duration situation. So we would consider closing the road and detouring traffic, even if it's just a daytime closure. We've done a couple projects with high friction surface treatment where we kind of had an idea that, on a 20-foot wide roadway, we're doing 1 lane at a time of high friction with the automated machines. They take up a lot of space. So we pulled the trigger and just said, we're going to close the road to detour traffic for the day that it takes to get the high friction surface treatment in place, and then open the road back up when that's cured. That's worked very well. And again, not always possible, but where it's possible, I would consider that as my first choice. That way you don't have to deal with traffic at all, except for the folks that live there and want to get in and out of their homes. And you still need flaggers for that. But again, it's minimizing how much traffic is going through your work zone as well. The other thing to consider, depending on the type of operation you're doing, you may be able to do some temporary stoppages of traffic in both directions. So you're not closing a lane, you're using flaggers to stop traffic so the workers can get out, do a little bit of work, open that back up. Maybe it's a 15-minute closure with flaggers. I would consider, depending on the area, maybe having law enforcement help you out with that as well, help keep traffic under control. And then open the road back up, allow traffic to clear out, and then repeat that operation again until the work is done. Not all types of work will allow that operation to occur, but it's a consideration that should be made for these narrow cross-section type roadways, especially in your rural areas where you're going to have limited space and limited right-of-way to move traffic around your work area. Some final considerations. Generally, we'd like to avoid situations where there's no escape route for your workers. There's always that chance that an errant vehicle is going to encroach in your work area, and you want to be able to allow your workers to run from that and get out into an area where they can escape from that errant vehicle. If we have traffic on both sides of us, there's no escape route, because if they're running left or right, they're running into traffic, unfortunately. So that's something we really want to strive to avoid as much as possible. There's times where it's not possible to avoid that, but I think there's enough solutions out there, such as the temporary stoppages, buffer lanes where possible, closing the road if necessary, even if it's a short-term closure, to avoid those situations with no escape route. If we're in long-term work zones, consider positive protection. Think about the type of barrier that you're utilizing and what type of deflection that barrier is going to have when struck. Typically, concrete barrier will have a 4 to a 5 foot deflection, lateral deflection. So if you don't have 4 or 5 feet behind your barrier, you need to consider in certain situations about pinning that barrier. And there's plenty of pinned barrier options that are available on the marketplace now that are MASH compliant. So those things should be considered. They're definitely more expensive, but sometimes, that extra expense is going to save somebody's life. Movable barrier options, as I explained for the one example on our I-95 project a few years ago, those are considerations that can be made as well. Again, there's an expense here, and you also need to consider the deflection of the movable barrier. They will deflect a lot more than typical concrete barrier. But again, that's something that should be considered in certain situations. Consider your overall duration when planning your traffic control for your work activities. Again, shorter duration is going to likely lead to less devices or maybe more portable devices. Excuse me. Take that into account when you're planning your work zones. Again, you don't want to have the whole gamut of devices for an hour, because then you're just exposing your workers unnecessarily to traffic. Quality of traffic control devices is important as well. If we have clear traffic control devices that are clean, that are reflective, motorists are going to respect them more. They're going to provide more of a message to the approaching motorist, and that's going to help keep traffic out of your workspace. Make sure everybody's wearing high visibility safety apparel. It's a requirement in most cases. I know in Delaware, we require anybody that's working in the state right of way to have high visibility safety apparel. Other states will have similar requirements as well. It is important just to make your workers visible to the approaching motorists. If you can, combine your work activities to minimize exposure. Sometimes it might be better to pull the Band-Aid off quickly and try to combine enough work activities. Maybe you're going to need to do a lane closure over an entire weekend to get some things done, and you're going to have a little bit of a traffic impact for that one weekend, but then you're done and out of that area, and you don't have to worry about going back. So it's one quick impact and you're out of there. So consider that as well to minimize the exposure of your workers and minimize exposure of traffic to the work zone. I want to thank everybody for the opportunity to present today, and I'll take any questions that anybody has.
We have one question, Adam. What are or where can I find requirements for lighting for mobile operations? For example, trash, brush, or leaf collection crews starting in the early morning hours.
There's guidance. ATSA has guidance related to work zone lighting considerations. If you go to their website and I think search under their work zone grant information, I believe there's some guidance documents there that will provide some information about lighting considerations. The METCD has lighting requirements for flagger stations. Might be useful for the brush clearing or the early morning situations as well. There's a bunch of portable lights that are on the market, not just pull behind, the light tower that you can pull behind, but even ones that hook into your truck's hitch receiver. That are balloon lighting, and they provide an ample amount of light. I know DelDOT has been testing them on incident scenes. They have some, again, like I said, some go into your hitch receiver, some are on tripods, stands. They're highly portable, and they put out a lot of light similar to what a typical light tower would put out.
And that's all.
I'd say, we have plenty of time here, so we can open it up to the floor. We've got time to
answer. If anybody has a particular situation that they've run into that they'd like to talk about and maybe think about ideas for how you can address it. I'd be open for that too.
And it looks like we have one that just came in the chat box. It says, in case of closing both lanes of a road and initiating a temporary road, how to determine the width of a temporary road route in order to allow traffic for both trucks and vehicles?
I think it's going to depend on whatever design guidance your state or whatever jurisdiction you're working in, whatever design guidance they have available. I know in projects I've been involved with, we've done temporary roadways with 12-foot lanes and 8-foot shoulders, which is similar to the roadway that we've closed. But we've had the space to do that. If depending on your vehicle mix, if you have a higher than average truck percentage, I would try to strive for 12-foot lanes. But if you can do 11-foot lanes and some level of shoulder for, just for that safety buffer, not just from a work zone perspective, but even just from a roadside design perspective, that would be ideal. Again, looking at your speeds, looking at your vehicle mix, all of those factors will come into play in figuring out the width of your temporary roadway. Generally, we try to match the existing in those situations. Again, like I said, it depends on how much space you have. I know there was a project a few years ago. Oh, that's probably like 15 years ago now, where we had to design a 6-lane temporary roadway around a bridge project. And then that temporary roadway eventually became part of a future ramp system. So, and future local road system. So portions of that were reused as well. But it was, in order to maintain capacity, we had to have 6 lanes, 3 in each direction. So, that all went into the consideration of the size of that temporary roadway.
Okay, thank you, Adam. There's a question in the chat box about I-66. I don't know if you're able to comment on that one or not.
Let me pull up the chat pod a minute. Sir, during the work activities. I would probably need a little bit more information on that. I'm not familiar with the work activities on I-66. But if I'll provide my email address in the chat pod, and if somebody wants to email me on about that, I can do that. That's fine.
Okay, and then we have another question. It looks like from Matt Carter. If you could address that one. And the question is: it seems like a tailgate safety meeting, including flagger personnel, prior to these limited access work zones, could heighten awareness of the risks and important mitigation for all workers. You agree on that one?
Absolutely. I think the more information you give to your workers, the better. Especially, think about this: if you're even as a designer, if you're a designer, you're designing a work zone. You may not necessarily know what's going to happen in the field that day. So if the superintendent or the foreman or whoever's in charge can have that tailgate safety meeting with everybody that's going to be involved and look at the work zone, look at where the escape routes are going to be, look at where the flagger station is going to be. Having everybody on the same page is going to be, it's just an extra step to take to looking out for everybody's safety. And if Matt's bringing coffee to that, I'm all for it.
Don't forget the donuts.
All right.
Adam, one more question. In Pittsburgh, we're doing a massive project on a busy 3-lane corridor. During construction, 2 lanes will be closed. Is it a good idea to offer a detour for overflow traffic if the one open lane isn't enough?
Absolutely. Yeah. We alternate routes, whether you're closing lanes or even just if you're maintaining the normal amount of lanes and you're just going to have delays just because of the presence of the work zone, having a signed alternate route is very important. You will get some diversion. You might get 5-10% maybe during a normal day because once people sit in that traffic in that queue and they're frustrated enough, they're going to want to find alternate ways to get around that on a daily basis. The other benefit of having an alternate route, regardless of what available capacity you have in your work zone, is you have a signed route if there's ever an incident and you need to close that close a roadway in that work zone for some reason. Let's say there's just a bad crash, a hazmat spill in that work zone. There's no other way around that incident. You have a signed route already to divert traffic around that area. So yeah, definitely alternate routes are a good consideration.
Okay, we still got some time here, so I'll leave it open. And if you do want to take a question, you can take your microphone off and if you like. Just let us know who you are, where you're calling from.
And I did provide my email address in the chat pod to everyone. So if you have questions or anything comes up you'd like to ask, feel free. Don't hesitate.
Thank you, Adam.
I guess maybe I'd like to pose a question to the group. Folks that are from DOTs or local jurisdictions. What types of requirement or what types of inspections do you do on your temporary traffic control setups? I know when I was at DelDOT, the one responsibility that my group had was the periodic review of highway work zones and making sure that they were compliant with the MUTCD, the plans, make sure the devices were up to good quality, a little bit beyond what the typical construction inspector might look at on a daily basis. Do any other jurisdictions have similar requirements? And if you do, I think these are the types of things, looking at these escape routes and limited space areas, that you might be able to try to point out and make improvements on if you see them set up.
You can either reply in the chat box to that or just audio in.
Okay, so there's a chat recommendation for intermittent emergency shoulder clear zones per linear feet mile. I believe the MUTCD is every 2 miles, but I'd have to confirm that. I believe the MUTCD does provide guidance on that typically. It's usually around 2 miles. In Arlington, we own our roads. Okay, so Arlington County, they own their own roads and have a daily inspector monitoring TTC all the time. That's great. And if they're able to make corrections on the fly, that's just going to make the situation that much better for the workers and for the traveling public. And the key is, even if you're using daily inspection, the key is to get them trained in work zone. Whether it's through an ATSA course or a state course or in just general traffic control training, just so they have an idea of what they're looking at beyond just a series of cones and signs and drums and all of that.
How does, Adam, I'm going to throw a question out here.
Sure.
How does weather really impact the limited space? I mean, when you start dealing with snow and adverse conditions, I mean, how do you adjust on that on the fly?
I think in wet weather conditions brings out a whole new issue. Obviously the wetter the pavement, the longer braking distance you're going to have. So the more of that longitudinal buffer space is going to be needed. And I think consideration really should be in certain situations of maybe delaying the work because of adverse weather conditions. If it's pouring down rain and visibility is just completely obstructed because of the rain and the road is completely drenched, obviously the workers, I don't think workers are going to want to be out there in the rain, pouring down rain, if they don't have to be. But if it's, for planned work zones, you might want to delay those. But if it's an emergency situation, let's say, I know, maintenance issues pop up in every rainstorm where you're going to have a clogged pipe or clogged drainage inlet. the amount of buffer space that you can provide to keep traffic off your back is going to be the best opportunity for keeping your worker safe, and having that crash truck or TMA behind the workers to keep them safe as well.
Got it. Thanks.
Adam, this is Matt. One of the things that I hear from time to time, from workers, sort of mainline workers, is they, and some of it is I was always told that kind of thing, and not necessarily an informed view, but sometimes it is where they're concerned that the work zone setup isn't quite as it should be, or something of that notion. I think in general, that's something that, they ought to feel comfortable raising with their supervisor. Is that even more the case where we've got these sort of modified approaches where there are particular concerns where they should feel comfortable to raise those questions in a sort of constructive manner and try to make sure that there's a free flow of ideas and concerns?
Absolutely. If a worker's out there and they don't feel comfortable with something, they do need to bring it to the attention of their supervisor, and the supervisor needs to address it appropriately. I know there are situations where you might have a particular worker that just doesn't feel like working today, and they're going to come up with every excuse in the book, and including, the safe setup of the work zone is going to be questioned. So obviously you're going to have to kind of address those issues as well as a supervisor. So trying to make sure you take the concerns as seriously as possible and addressing them as best as possible is important. But a worker should never be afraid to speak up if they really feel like they're in danger, in my opinion. I know we've always told that to our contractors and to our inspection staff. Even if our inspection staff didn't feel that it was safe for the workers to be in a particular situation, they were obligated to speak up and talk to the contractor about it, and make the contractor aware of the need to address that situation. And Matt, I think you answered Dakota's question.
Do what I can.
And I know we've had situations in the past with workers where, like I said, they just get out there and for some reason they just don't feel like working that day, and they're going to make whatever, they're going to question everything. And I know my staff in the past have been called to work zones for those exact situations and have gone through the work zone with the employee, the contractor, superintendent, the state inspector on that's assigned to that project, and have said, hey, yeah, this work zone set up per plan, or yes, these concerns are legitimate and they need to be addressed, and this is how you should address them.
Okay. Well, I think we are just coming up to the 50-minute mark here, so I want to thank Adam for presenting here, and Rusty as moderator, and thank the attendees for attending this session. Just a reminder that all the presentations from the conference today and tomorrow, the slide decks are available in PDF format for you to download. So when you go back to when you leave this, you can access those files in the Talent LMS platform for download. And if you missed a session, for instance, if you wanted to see what happened in the drones presentation and you weren't able to see the drones presentation, those slides are available. The presentation is available for download. So at this point, I would thank everybody for attending, and you can leave the classroom in the lower right-hand corner, and that'll take you back to the Talent LMS platform. And you should then have 10 minutes to do whatever you need to do, answer some work emails, and then get into classroom. And the breakout sessions are either asphalt pavement preservation projects, achieving quality through proper planning and monitoring of the work in progress, presented by Sam Gregory, and the other option, ethics, presented by David Orr. So those sessions start at 11 a.m. So Thank you very much, everyone, and we'll see you in the next session.
Great. Thank you, everybody, for attending.
Thank you, Adam.
Thanks, Adam.